Thank you all for joining our StorCycle demonstration webinar. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available through SpectraLogic's website. You're muted on the audio portion of today's webinar, but please submit any questions you have through the GoToWebinar console. So I'll introduce Jeff Bronstein, our Spectra expert who will demonstrate StorCycle. But before I do that, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that StorCycle has now gone generally available. We released a press release this week, and if you'd like to read that press release, it is on our SpectraLogic website. Easily you can navigate there by spectralogic.com/company/news. And with that said, Jeff, please take it away.
Thank you much, DB. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, this is Jeff Bronstein, Product Management on SpectraLogic. Today, I'm happy to talk a bit about and demonstrate to you our new product, StorCycle. It's storage management software. What it's primarily focused on is identifying inactive or less active data on a more expensive storage system and moving it to lower cost or more affordable storage. And it really has four main functionalities or features. We call them pillars in StorCycle that's focused on. First thing it'll do is it's going to connect to your primary or active storage and identify what is inactive or what needs to be moved. And you'll see demonstrations of that in a bit. There's both automated and manual ways to do that. The second, of course, is it's going to migrate that data. It's going to move it to lower cost storage. That could be the cloud. That could be NAS. It could be object storage disk. It could be tape. It could be any combination thereof, which brings us to our next area that StorCycle focuses on, which is protecting the data. One of the important things we do, of course, is we make sure the data is safely transported using checksums or fingerprints to identify and make sure that the data hasn't changed. We strongly encourage making multiple copies of the data because once a tool like this, the storage management software, it's going to migrate your less active or inactive data, but you're still going to want to have backup software or some sort of backup or replication software running on your active storage system. This data will no longer be part of that backup or replication scheme. So protecting it is critical, and multiple copies is the best way to do that. We encourage multiple copies of the data in multiple geographic locations for the best protection to ensure you never lose your data. We also make available things like ejected tape copies, for example, to ensure that your data can't be accessed by by software, ransomware, and things like that. And then finally, we make the data easily accessible, and we'll show you the different ways that that can be done in the demonstration. Let's see a little visually about what the product looks like so you can picture it. So over on the left, you've got your active, or what we often call your primary storage tier. That can consist of one or more devices. It could be Windows-based systems. It could be Linux, sysSMB with Active Directory. It could be NFS with LDAP, things like that. And then over on the right, we have what we call our perpetual storage tier. This is going to be your lower cost tier of storage to migrate and protect the data. So StorCycle will connect to all those primary storage devices as a traditional file system. So anything it can connect to from that server as a file path, right? It'll run on a Windows or a Linux server. Anything that server can connect to, whether it's local storage, block storage, NAS storage, as long as it can access it as a file path from that server, we can scan and migrate the data. And then StorCycle will move it to one or more of three types of storage targets. That could include NAS, and it might be SpectraLogic's Black Pearl NAS, for example, which is really focused on storing inactive data very affordably, but it could be any other kind of NAS as well. It could be the cloud. For our first release, we'll support any Amazon or anything that can emulate or look like Amazon. And then finally, we support our Black Pearl storage system. Converged storage system. The Black Pearl converged storage system essentially acts as an object storage gateway to tape and object storage disk. So with a very simple cloud S3 type interface, Black Pearl makes all these different types of storage targets available. Black Pearl itself can also move data to the cloud, and it can move data to other sites via replication. Black Pearl was initially designed really to make it easy to work with tape, and since then we've added these other types of storage targets, and then based on the policies that you set on this Black Pearl converged storage system, you can migrate the data that you send to it to one or more of these storage targets. And that's just one of the storage targets, again, that StorCycle can use in combination with this NAS or public cloud. So StorCycle runs on a server, as I mentioned. SpectralLogic does not provide any or sell any hardware with it. It's strictly a software-based installer file that we provide, either as a MSI installer in Windows or a package on Linux. And then again, once it's installed there, it just connects to any type of storage. So you can use it with, for example, with Spectra storage, because that's one of the things we do have, is we do sell NAS, we do sell tape and object storage disk, but you don't have to. You could use cloud, and you could use some other vendors' NAS. Let's go ahead and take a little look at the product here. What I'll focus on first is doing kind of the most common workflow. I'll show you just a quick high-level overview of the interface. Then we'll do a scan, a migrate of data, and a restore of data. And then I'll go into a little more detail in the interface and the particulars and configuration and so forth. So I have StorCycle running on my local computer here. So you can see the URL here is localhost. That's an indicator. And this is the home page of StorCycle. And I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of exciting data that I've migrated. I have to occasionally reinstall the product as we're testing new versions. So I don't have a lot of migrated data showing. But obviously, we'll show you how much data you've moved, both by storage locations as well as by departments that you can tell us about. And then similarly, we also provide cost information. So for each storage location, you can tell us how much it costs for you to have that storage in dollars per terabyte. That could be both the source of the storage and the target of the storage. So for example, if your source storage is $1,000 a terabyte and your target storage is $100 a terabyte, and you moved 1 terabyte, then you've saved $900, right? So we do that math for you and show you those cost savings. We also show you how much target storage is being used up on your targets, as well as how many files or objects on all those. We also give you information about your licensing, which is primarily user-based, not capacity-based, particularly for Spectra storage. We show you the performance of all the systems, all the jobs that are going on. A job can be a scan operation, a migrate operation where we're essentially archiving data, or it could be a restore operation. And then we show you the aggregate scan data. So we can scan the source storage and provide information about the size and age of that data. And we'll go into a little more detail about that when we do a scan. But that's the basics of the dashboard. Now I'm logged in as an administrator, so I can see and do everything. That means that I can go into this menu here, this gear icon, and I can configure everything about the system, Active Directory, users, departments, the storage locations, and so forth. If I'm not an administrator, I maybe have a role called a storage manager. This is somebody who can't do this kind of configuration of the system, but they can do the day-to-day migration or archive and restore of data. And so they will see this navigation over here on the left, and that will allow them to get onto all the key components of the product. And that's something they can go to, on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis, whatever they need to do to get to that. Let's go ahead and do a scan first. Now I'm going to scan some source data just to make it simple. I've actually got something on my C drive here. Typically this is probably going to be something like a NAS storage device potentially, or some other drive letter. But I'm gonna go ahead and move this data. You can see it's located at C StorCycle source. I've got this project here called Research Project 17. And that reminds me, I did want to cover one other item before I go into the demo. I apologize. StorCycle supports 2 different types of migration. In other words, workflows of how you think about migrating your data. The first is what most traditional data management or storage management softwares do. We call it auto-migrating inactive data. This is where I want StorCycle, I want to point StorCycle, say, to a share or directory, and I want it to find data that should be archived. In other words, I want it to find the old or inactive data. So StorCycle can scan the data, it can determine the age of the data, and based on policies that you set, you can then decide what the threshold is for what you want to archive. So for example, you may, first of all, what is age? We should also discuss that for a minute. Age can be either the last access date of the file, which is the default in StorCycle, but you could also change that to the last modified date or the creation date of the file. So once you've determined that age and then also sizes, then you can set policies of what you want to archive based on age and size. And then what StorCycle will do is on some periodic basis, it will go through and it will scan that directory or that share and look for files that meet those criteria of a certain age and size and take them off. And so you might have a job that runs once a month or something like that, that looks for any files that have reached that threshold and past that. And that's one very good use case. That's the case where I kind of call that general IT data. Maybe I'm an IT manager. I don't really have visibility to the different projects that my organization is working on and when they become inactive. I want the system to figure that out for me. Now, the other use case is that there's a lot of organizations that do understand what needs to be migrated, and they work, and a lot of times in the concept of projects or directories. So we call this the migrating project directories option. In this, maybe I'm a research site, maybe I've got a genomic sequence test results, maybe I have autonomous vehicle runs, maybe I have a movie I've just filmed or a TV episode, and I want to archive that as a project, and I've probably got it in some sort of directory. I want to move everything in that directory. It's a one-time event. I want to be able to archive that whole thing, every file in it. I want to be able to tag it, give the project a name, give it some metadata values so that I can easily find it later. And I'll probably do other projects the same way. For the purposes of our demonstration, we're actually going to do this second one, the migrating project directories. But as we go through, I'll also talk about how you would set it up to run the first one, the more automated method. So let's go back to our directory here, this research project 17. And first, let's go ahead and do a scan. A scan is not required before I migrate the data, but it is available there for you so you can make better decisions. So we'll go ahead and go over here to scan. And I will say I want to do a new scan. I can give it a name, and that name is auto-generated, so I can use the default if I want, or I can change it. I can then set the storage location. Now this is something I've already configured in StorCycle, is this storage location. I named it primary share, and as you can see, it points to the C StorCycle source directory, so everything in there now shows up. I can choose a subdirectory, or I can choose the root. We were looking at project 17, so I'm going to select that, and I'll check next. Then it asks me, when do I want to run the scan? I can run it now. I can run it maybe like at a time in the future, say Saturday night when the system is being used less, or I can do a recurring schedule where maybe I want to scan this directory on some regular basis and see how I'm doing. We'll go ahead and choose scan now, and this directory just has a very few amount of files in it. In fact, I should have showed you that. So here's Research Project 17. It's got just 7 directories, each have a few files in them of various sizes. So very small. I just wanted to run this fast. The scan is done already. It was very fast because it's just a handful of files. We can see it ran. And if I click on the job here, I can see the details of the job. It tells me it completed with no errors. It tells me the total size of all the files in that directory, how many there are, and it gives me a nice graph that shows me the age and size of the data. My default right now is set to last modified date, so these are when the files are last modified. You can see I've got some files in this range going from 90 days up to greater than 7 years. And you can see also it color codes it based on the size of the files. We believe at SpectraLogic that it may not always make sense to archive a lot of, especially if you have small files. They tend to not give you a lot of, they don't free up a lot of space when you move them. They tend to transfer more slowly than large files. And if you're moving to something like the cloud where you're paying for things on a per object or per file basis, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to move those. So we tend to encourage filters not just on age of data but size as well, and so that's why we give that information. Now let's go ahead and migrate this data, And what we will do is, so we're going to migrate this entire research project 17. And what we're going to do, if we go back to our diagram here, we're going to take it off of the source storage system and we're going to move it to a black pearl, and it's going to go to tape. And the way that's going to work, this is a tool we use to browse black pearl. We call it the Eon browser. Over on the right, this shows all my top-level containers in black pearl. They're called buckets. It's a similar term that we use, of course, for the cloud, like Amazon. They use that same term. But this bucket that I'm going to move my data into has a particular data placement policy on it. When data goes into this bucket, Jeff Neo Test 3, the data policy says make one copy to tape. And so that's what we'll do. So anything that goes in this bucket called Jeff Neo Test 3 will have one copy written to tape automatically. The StorCycle software doesn't need to know that. It just needs to know the name of the bucket where it wants to put the data, and then Black Pearl takes care of that data placement policy. And this Neo is our code. It was our code name internally for StorCycle before we came up with the official name. So hence the name of that bucket. So we'll go ahead and do that migration right now. We'll click on Migrate Store in the left navigation. And again, remember, we're doing this project-based archive, right? So we're going to archive everything in this Research Project 17 directory. So we'll go ahead and go to the Migrate Store. We'll click on New Migrate Store Project. Let's say this is Research 17. So I give this project a name. That name is important because I can use it to search for these files or this project later. So that's a key metadata value, if you will. I can optionally give it a description that'll show up in reports and so forth. Again, I'll choose my source. I just have one, the primary share. I'll choose Research Project 17. And so now I've kind of identified where the data is coming from. Next is how I'm going to choose what to move. The first thing it asks is, do you want to use the last scan you just did, the one we did moments ago, or would you like StorCycle to do a new scan before it migrates the data? Obviously, if we can reuse a scan, that's going to be more efficient, so I will choose that. Now, if we were setting up an automated job that we wanted to run, monthly or weekly or quarterly to scan this directory and look for old files, we might set an age and size threshold. We might say, let's archive everything that's greater than 1 year and more than a megabyte in size. And you can see my graph is dynamically changing as I do that and identifies how much data will currently be archived if I do that. But what we want to do, and so once I set those filters up, I could have this job run and automatically on a scheduled basis, right, every month or something. But we want to do a one-time archive of the entire project, so we'll set that to all ages and sizes. I can also add some additional filters. For the first release, we identified the most common filters that our users wanted. That was to include certain types of files only, so they set a filter to only include certain file types and exclude the rest. They also have the ability to exclude certain directories. Maybe there's certain directories. This is common in the media and entertainment space where you've got commonly shared assets. You might want to make sure that those don't get archived. The next thing I'll choose is where do I want the data to go. So that bucket I showed you, Jeff Neo Test 3 on Black Pearl, that's this one here. It's BP5 one copy tape. So that's the target, that storage target that I set up in StorCycle to point to that bucket in Black Pearl. I can choose multiple targets as well. Maybe I also want to move it to Amazon, or maybe I want to move it to another Black Pearl or to a NAS or something like that. I can do that here, and both copies or 3 copies will automatically be made. For this demo, we'll just keep it simple with 1 copy. Next is, what do I want to replace the file with when I take it away? So I'm going to take the files away out of that directory, off of the source storage. What, if anything, do I want to leave in their place? The first option we have, which is the default, is to leave these HTML links. And I'll show you what that looks like as we go through the demo here and show you why we think those are great and special, and nobody else has anything else like that. In the third release of the product, we'll also have what we call symbolic links. That's where you can have an invisible pointer. So you replace the original file with a symbolic link, and the symbolic link points to the new location of the file, say on a NAS target. And to users or applications, it looks like the file hasn't moved because the pointer gives them transparent access to that file. So that's another option we'll have soon. The other option is you could just take the file away completely and leave nothing behind. And then finally, you could also make a copy of the file. Maybe you want to leave the file on source storage, and maybe you're just making a protective copy of the file on the target. Now, StorCycle is not a backup application, right? It's not doing the sophisticated things that backup applications do, like snapshots. But it can make some basic protective copies. Maybe you produce a reality TV show and you have footage coming in from the field every day. And before you start working with the video files, you want to make an extra copy of them just to make sure you don't lose them. So you could use StorCycle for something like that. But we'll go ahead and choose these HTML links. So we're going to replace the file with HTML files, and you'll see how that works in a minute. I can also add these tags. If you've ever used like a MAM application, we're definitely not a MAM application, but we can allow you to just tag data to help you find it later more easily. So maybe this is, grant number 357, and I want to be able to find it that way later. And I can add as many additional tags as I want here to the project. Finally, I can choose the schedule. Since I'm doing a project-based one-time archive, I'd probably choose to start it now or some point in the future. If I'm doing an automated scan that's automatically going to find old files, then I would set up a recurring schedule. But we'll go ahead and say start now. We'll click submit. Now we should almost immediately see the files start moving to the Black Pearl. Now you can see here the job is active and it's going. Now we're going to cheat a little bit and take a peek into the Black Pearl and see what's going on there. Now this is again that application that allows us to look into Black Pearl. This is not something that the users of StorCycle need or would probably ever use, but it's just for me to show you what's going on. So if I go here to Jeff Neo Test 3, you can see first of all immediately that the original directory structure is retained. And if I click refresh here, we will see, I believe, there's our research project 17. So we can see that's all there, and you can see what we really try to do is we keep the original structure, the full path, and we also keep the files in their native names. So that way, if StorCycle were to ever to go away or you wanted to be able to access the files without StorCycle, there's no hidden or encoding things that we do. We keep everything in an open format. Now you can see that these files have landed on the disk cache of Black Pearl. So they've initially made it to the Black Pearl gateway, and in a few moments they will be written to tape. That's not an immediate action. If I go back and look at the previous job I did, so I was just doing a dry run this morning to make sure everything was working as usual, and so I did research project 16, and you can see the files here are not only on the Black Pearl cache, but they've also now been written to tape. So these files are complete. So once StorCycle sees that the files are completely written to the final storage target, it considers the files safe. So for Research Project 17, the files aren't on tape yet, so we'll see that the files are still here. They haven't been removed. But if I go back to my previous project, Research Project 16, I can see that the files have been replaced with these HTML files. So let's go ahead and take a look at those and do a restore with those. So I'll go ahead and open one of those HTML files in a browser just to show you what it looks like. So this HTML file, we sort of call it a breadcrumb. That's sort of our nickname for them. So it acts as a breadcrumb showing you that the file was there because it's got the same name, but you can see it's got a .html extension. So it's, instead of file1.txt, it's file1.text.html. When I open it, it tells me, hey, the file has been archived. Here's where it was archived to. Here's when it was archived. Here's the size. Hey, and if you'd like to go ahead and restore the file, click on these buttons. If you just want to restore that one file back to its original location, you can click here. If you'd like to expand and maybe add other files and maybe restore to a different location, then you can choose the second button. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we're going to try to do is just restore this file1.txt. So I'll click on restore now. It'll ask me to log in. I'll just use my base administrator account. Now, if I don't have an account on StorCycle, I can press this button instead, and I can send a request to an administrator to ask for the file to be restored. So we do have still that capability, but if you don't have permission, you won't be able to restore the file. So I'll click login. I'll go ahead here. It's going to pre-populate the restore wizard with all the values to get the file back. I'll click next. The only thing I have to really choose is where I want it to go back. I want it to go back to the primary share. I'll click next. I want it to be restored right now. And hopefully if I go back here, sure enough, we've got our file back. So it's as simple as that. So the HTML links, why did we build those? Why didn't we make it, transparent or something? Well, the challenge we wanted to be able to work with well at Spectra is we wanted to be able to deal with storage targets that have a longer restore time. So if you think about something like Amazon Glacier or tape libraries, tape, they can take minutes or hours for data to come back. You think about the new Deep Glacier tier on Amazon, your files can take 12 hours to come back. There's no way you're going to trick the user into thinking that the file is still there. So by using the HTML link, it's not a transparent experience. The user has to understand the file's gone and take an action. But we think this is a much more reasonable way to go than trying to trick them in some way by using symbolic links or stub files. You may be familiar with those. That's where you have like the first few bytes of a file to kind of keep the application open and going. We don't believe those are good paradigms when you have these really long wait times. And we think that the HTML links are a reasonable compromise to that. When I go back, by the way, you also can get notifications here. So you can see the restore job is completed here. I got this email from StorCycle. So I could go off and, go get my coffee or start the restore tonight because I know that I need my research data back on the primary storage system tomorrow, so I can use it again. And so I can know when it's done. I can get that notification. So it's very simple. So that's restores. Now, in addition to the HTML links, if you don't have those, if you don't want to use the HTML links, you can also go into the search tool in StorCycle. You can get to that either by clicking on restores here in the left navigation, or more simply, you can click on this magnifying glass in the top right. This will allow you to search for the files that you want to restore. You can search for them by project name, by file or directory name, and you can also search by the tags you've added to the project. So we believe that between the three of these options, you're probably going to be able to find what you're looking for. Now let me just tell you a little bit about some of the administrator views and so forth. So we obviously have a system message tool, and a lot of this you can sign up to get emails for these if you so choose. Other settings we have are, of course, Active Directory. So I should say, of course, I'm running the Windows version of StorCycle. I have it running here on my Windows 10 laptop. We will also have, we believe around the end of January, we'll have that Linux version available that will allow you to archive to NFS, or archive off of NFS shares and Linux-based storage systems. We can connect to either Active Directory or LDAP authentication. This allows us to do two things. It allows us to create users in the system so that they can log in and access and archive and restore, but it also allows us to connect so that we can get all the permissions off of files, right? Like the ACLs. Who has permissions to what files? What are those permissions? In Linux, we also will be collecting, the extended attributes, if you've heard of that. Our system collects those, puts them in the database, writes them to the targets as well. So like, for example, on Amazon or on our Black Pearl gateway, we add all those permissions, or ACLs as we call them, to the metadata of the object in the system, so it's kind of a standalone thing. So this is great, useful information. I can configure Active Directory here. I put in the information, to connect. Then I can have, or LDAP, like I said, and then I can have those users in the LDAP or Active Directory system connect to StorCycle. One thing I can also do is I can allow any Active Directory or LDAP user to do restores. So by checking this box, anybody that has an account on the network, on the Active Directory or LDAP system, can do the restores. And in the future, we'll also have the ability to add thresholds to that. Like maybe you only want people to be able to restore up to, 2 terabytes or something like that. So you'll be able to set that. Next, we of course have users that can be set up. And you can see that, you can receive different types of notifications. We have 2 different types of roles, as I mentioned, administrators and storage managers. This could be an Active Directory or LDAP user here, or just a user that you create right on StorCycle. We also have departments and the concept of departments. This is primarily for cost accounting. So if you want to add departments and see, how much money or how much storage different departments have, you can associate these departments to the storage locations, and then the tracking is automatic based on that. Of course, we've got all of our storage locations, so I chose storage here from the menu. So this is both my sources and targets of storage, so I can set up my source storage. I can set up targets, which could include, S3 or Amazon, the Black Pearl, NAS. It's all done in this same place. One thing I can do that's interesting, if I set up, say, a NAS storage location, I'll just pick a couple values here to get to the next screen. If I choose a NAS spectral storage location, I can limit the transfers during peak or non-peak hours. So I can say, Monday through Friday from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., I want to limit the scan objects per second and the bandwidth of the system so that I don't overwhelm the primary storage system. And in off-peak hours, I'll set that to whatever I want as well when it's not during those peak hours. That will help make sure that the system doesn't cause any problems with overloading. The other thing to mention, is if you use Black Pearl as a target, we can do what's called packing, where if you've got a lot of small files that you do want to archive, we can put those into a tar or zip pack. This will speed up the transfer of the files as well as make the management in Black Pearl easier by reducing the object count on the Black Pearl database. The next thing to show you is our licenses and SSL certificates. So this is where you load all the keys for the system. I've got a trial key that's running. And I should mention, when you download StorCycle, it comes with a 60-day trial. If you'd like access to us to play with StorCycle, we can work with you on that to use that trial. You can also use an SSL certificate. This allows you to, you can see right now I'm getting a warning up here that says not secure in my browser because I'm not using a externally recognized SSL certificate, but I can load that if I so choose. You can also set up SMTP to receive the emails like I got to see that a restore was complete. You can, of course, generate logs. Database backups, this is really key. StorCycle runs on a database. We use MongoDB. It's extremely scalable. There's essentially no limit to what we can store in that database. But it does need to be protected, right? So what we encourage you to do, we really encourage you to do, is to back up that database to make sure that your data, the database is safely protected. And fortunately, you've got all these beautiful storage targets that you can move it to. So that's what you do, is you set up a job in this where you, on some recurring basis, hopefully nightly, make database backups and move those to one or more of your storage targets. If you don't set up those backups, you're going to get screamed at here with warnings from these systems, as well as getting email alerts and also alerts on the dashboard if you don't have those set up. You can see there it says here, no backup. So we really encourage that. And then finally, we've got some global settings that show you just some basic things about to set up at the high level about the product. One is, what currency do you want to use? The second is, how do you want to determine the age of the file? And I alluded to this earlier. The default in StorCycle is to use the last time the app file was accessed. Of course, that's the most logical. But you can also set it to last modified, and honestly, that works better for demos for me, because as I copy and paste files, the access time sometimes changes, but the modified time does not. So you can use modified time, or you can even use creation time. And then, of course, session timeout. We have it set to 8 hours. That's the session right now of this browser session. It'll also be actually the session time of the API interface of StorCycle. So right now, this web interface that I'm using here is talking to the StorCycle server, right? So it's communicating with this server, its web interface, via an API. And so right now, only the web interface can access that API. But probably in the third or fourth release, towards the end of next year, we'll expose that API, and then you'll be able to actually programmatically interact with StorCycle. So for example, you could programmatically scan, archive, or restore a file, or maybe get data on what jobs are running, or maybe get reports on how much data has been moved to the various storage targets and so forth. So we're really excited about getting to that point. And I think I will go ahead and stop there. With that, DB, I think we'll hand it over to you to see if any questions have come in that I can answer.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And we do have a couple of questions for you to address. So the first question is, I have multiple storage targets that I like to archive data to. How does StorCycle work with that?
Sure. So as we saw in the picture visually, we have these options of 3 targets. And then also within the Black Pearl itself, we can set up 1 or more targets, right? So a common policy in Black Pearl, for example, might be, hey, when I move data into a bucket in Black Pearl, make 2 copies to tape, or make a copy to tape and make a copy to disk for 6 months. That way the first 6 months that I access the file, it'll come back quickly from disk, and after 6 months I'll still get it, but a little more slowly from tape. So I can set up the multiple storage targets just behind Black Pearl itself and have StorCycle just move data into a Black Pearl bucket, and Black Pearl takes care of all the copies. Otherwise, I can move data into these 1 or more locations from StorCycle itself. And you may have missed it, but when I was doing the migration demo, I'll just throw in some dummy data here so I can get to the screen I want to real quick. So when I choose targets here, I can choose, like we move data to Black Pearl, but say I also want to move data to Amazon. This is my personal Amazon account. So now if I were to archive the data now, it would automatically 1 copy to this Black Pearl and tape and 1 copy to Amazon. Right now, let's say you do have multiple copies and now you want to restore a file. That's another question that comes up a lot. We do have a built-in order of priority. So let's say I've made a copy to all 3, Black Pearl, NAS, and Cloud. When I ask for a file back, where's StorCycle going to get it from? Well, right now we have a built-in order of it'll go to NAS first, Black Pearl second, and Cloud third. But we do have it on the roadmap to make that configurable on jobs and policy level so that you can set that. Maybe you want to go to the Black Pearl first or something like that. So we'll have those available as well. Yep, good question. What else you got, DB?
Next question is sort of a 2-parter.
Okay.
What's the cost and what hardware is supported, and which agents are supported, like QNAP?
Yeah, great question. So the cost of StorCycle, we have 2 models. We have both a subscription and a permanent license. And like I said, or alluded to earlier, it's priced primarily based on the number of users. So a 3-user 1-year license starts at $7,200. And for our first year, actually, that's discounted to $4,800. It's our entry price. So for all of 2020, you can get that price, or through 2020. Up to our highest license, which is our permanent license, and it's the enterprise license. So it's unlimited users, it's unlimited data movement to the cloud. The price on that is $144,000, but through 2020, it is discounted to $96,000 for the entry level price. So hopefully and then there's ranges in between there. So talk to us and we'll give you all the details based on your particular needs. In terms of what StorCycle runs on, what we've primarily seen users, organizations install it on is on a virtual machine. So that could be a Windows VM, and officially we support Windows 2016, but we can work with you if you need to use an slightly older or newer version. And then for Linux, we'll be supporting CentOS 7.7 initially. But again, we can talk to you if you have to do it on something else. But presumably, the operating system probably doesn't matter to you too much because nothing else is going to be running on it but StorCycle. But anyways, that can be a virtual machine, right? So it can be on VMware or Windows, virtual setup, or it could be a dedicated server, whatever you want to do. So, but you provide the server to us. We give you the system requirements. I think it's 32 gigs of RAM, 4 cores, 500 gig hard drive, 10 gigabit or faster Ethernet connection. Those are the system requirements. So hopefully that answers your questions.
Our next question is, does StorCycle check for duplicate media?
It does. It does not. So there's some tools out there that, and they primarily scan. They don't migrate, but there's some tools out there that I'd say, hey, these files are duplicates, based on the hash or something like that, or whatever. No, we don't do that. We have it on our roadmap. To be honest, we're not sure how big a priority it is. What we're talking about doing for customers is moving, their data to storage that's 1/10 the cost or less oftentimes. So if, a small percentage of your files are duplicates, it's not as critical as just moving those files off to something that's lower cost. So that's where we've put the focus. I did also, I've just remembered, DB, somebody asked, I think, about QNAP and whether we can migrate off of that. I think the short answer is yes. Again, whatever this StorCycle server can connect to as a file. So for example, on Windows, right, I can connect to things as the C drive or the ML drive, or I can do, // server marketing. We have different marketing servers at Spectra, for example, right? Anything that I can mount like this, as a file, I can connect to. So assuming I can connect to that QNAP as CIFS or NFS or direct attached storage, whatever it is, yes, then I can scan and I can migrate data. So. Any other questions, DB?
Yeah. Next question is, if I restore a file, make changes to it, and then try to archive it again, what happens?
Right, so what we're really focused on with StorCycle is protecting your data and making sure it's safe. So in the first release of the product, if we see a file, in a directory called file1.txt, and it's supposed to be archived, we'll archive it. If we go back later and there's another file there with that same name, and it's supposed to be archived because of policy or because you've told us to archive it, we will not allow it, right? Because we don't want that file to be overwritten on the target. The file may have changed, and we don't want that to overwrite your old copy that we've archived. So we want to make sure that we protect it. Now what we'll do in probably the third release is we will introduce versioning. And with versioning, we'll allow you to store multiple copies of a file. So if we get another copy, if we have file1.txt, we archive it. Sometime later, another file1.txt shows up in that same directory and we're directed in some way to archive it, we can do that safely and we can keep both versions. And then when you do a restore, you can choose which version you want to restore. Of course, we'll default to the most recent, but you can choose another version as well if you want. So once we get there, we'll be able to do some a lot more interesting things with StorCycle.
All right, another question. Any possibility to import other older solutions such as SAM-FS?
I think the short answer is probably no. We can obviously, I think the way you would probably do that is you would restore the data into some temporary location, and that's something that Spectra can help provide, right? We have a very affordable NAS solution, and we often loan those systems out to customers as temporary landing zones. So you could pull that data back, and if, like SAM-QFS, let's assume it's on tape, then we can go ahead and restore that back from tape and then archive it into StorCycle. Another thing to think about is if you've got a system that, so one thing I should mention is when we archive to tape via Black Pearl, we write the data in an open LTFS format. So those tapes are not proprietary, they're open. So any data that we write, you could take that and put the tapes into another LTFS tape reader by, say, IBM or something, and you could access the files without StorCycle, without Black Pearl. If we have another vendor's LTFS file, so if I don't think SAM-QFS would have written those files in LTFS, but if they or others had, we could actually take those files in and import them into Black Pearl as well. So that's another option.
Great lead into our next question. Is a Black Pearl appliance required to archive to a tape library?
Yes, it is. So the main reason, as I kind of alluded to earlier, that we introduced Black Pearl was to make it easier to write data to tape. If you think about the limited applications that can currently write data to tape, there's not a lot. And the reason is it's very hard. You have to talk to each tape drive in the tape library. You have to talk to the robot. You have to understand what's on each tape. You have to know when to clean the tapes, things like that. It's very complicated. And so we wanted, but at the same time, tape is very affordable, it's very reliable, and we knew we wanted to continue to make it available to our customers as the best and most affordable, long-term storage option. So that's why we introduced Black Pearl. So Black Pearl introduces this very simple object storage S3-like interface on the front end, and then on the back end, Black Pearl takes care of all that complexity of managing the tapes and writing data to tape. It is typically it's a 2U or 4U appliance that you buy, so it is a physical piece of hardware. Of course, at its core, though, 95% of the engineers that work on Black Pearl are software engineers, so it's a very software-driven product, really focused around making sure that your data is safe.
Next question, can this be used to automate a disaster recovery process?
I think we'd probably have to sit down with you to understand exactly what that means, but we can certainly protect, we're protecting the files that are more inactive. That's what we're primarily focused on, right? So, and in the event of a disaster, you want to protect, you want to have those files accessible. So what we always encourage customers to do is to make at least 2 copies of their data in these type of archive solutions in 2 different geographic locations. So in my mind, yeah, you've got site A and site B. Site A is your primary primary site, and site B is your disaster recovery site. Site B might be the cloud. It might be another data center you have, or another branch office or something like that. It could be. But yeah, absolutely. In that sense, it is a disaster recovery. In terms of protecting your active data that's constantly changing and that you need to be able to back that up and recover it in the event of a disaster, that's still going to be the job of a backup or replication system, right? That's not something that we claim StorCycle can do.
Okay. How does StorCycle work with SAN storage like StoreNext?
Sure. So StorCycle can connect to StoreNext in a couple different ways, is my understanding, and I'll be honest, I don't have any direct experience with this myself, but my understanding is that, like on a Windows or Linux server, I think Windows, you can mount the SAN storage like as a drive letter, for example. So it's the F drive, the G drive, whatever. If that's the case, we can mount that via StorCycle, like I showed you, as a file path, and we can access that. Optionally, I understand that StoreNext, for example, has a plugin. I think like Avid Storage also has this, where you can add essentially a NAS interface to the storage by adding this plugin or small lightweight application to the server. So you would install that on the StorCycle server. That would give you file NAS path access to the storage, and then you could scan and migrate data in that way. So again, it all comes down to us being able to access it, some kind of file path. As long as we can do that, we can scan and migrate the data.
Okay. And does a Linux version mean that it'll also run on Mac OS?
It probably will, but we're not going to test or support that. We may, a majority of our engineers run on Macs, so I think it probably does, but it's, it comes down to our large testing organization to make sure that it's reliable. So we sort of have to pick at least initially, a flavor of, Unix or Linux that we want to run, and that most organizations are going to be okay with. So we choose CentOS 7.7 for the first release, but yeah, there's a good chance it'll work on Linux, and so you can maybe we may be able to allow you to use the trial version, but we will probably never support it in production well, I shouldn't say never. There are organizations who are still using Macs as, sort of servers essentially. And so we may in the future look at that, but primarily it'll probably be mostly focused on Linux.
And could you expand on the product timeline and support for Linux?
Yeah, so the Linux version is working now. We have it actually just next week. I'm scheduled to start installing it at our beta sites, but we have it working in our lab and everything. It's working fine. Our plan, I'm still waiting for a schedule from engineering. I've broadly been saying Q1 of next year, so that would be January to March. It could be as early as the end of January, but it may be a little bit later than that. But yeah, it's coming very soon, and like I said, it's already working. It's more of an issue of test effort for us at SpectralLogic right now.
All right, those are all the questions that we've received so far. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up, but I do want to provide you with a couple of reminders. If you are interested in getting a trial version of StorCycle, we're handling that with our solution architects, and we would love for you to reach out to them or to your Spectra sales rep, and we can arrange for a trial version of StorCycle for you. And if you would like to review this webinar, it is being recorded and will be posted on the main SpectralLogic webpage. With that, just want to thank everyone for your time and attendance, and hope to see you next time.